The judge looked at me and asked a single question that decided everything. If I was such a worthless husband, why was my name on financial records worth $8.7 million? I walked into the family courthouse in Denver that morning knowing I was already losing. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because the room had decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. I could feel it in the air, heavy and cold, like the kind of silence that settles right before a storm breaks. The hallway smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. People passed by without looking at me, couples whispering, lawyers moving with purpose, clerks carrying folders thick enough to crush someone. I sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, hands folded, staring at a scuff mark on the floor. I had tied my shoes twice that morning, not because they were loose, but because I needed something small to control. When the doors opened, I stood and walked in alone. On the other side of the room sat Laura. She did not look at me. She was dressed like this was a job interview. Perfect posture, calm expression, hands folded neatly in front of her. Next to her sat her parents, Richard and Margaret Hale, straight-backed and composed. They looked like people who expected to win, because they always did. I took my seat at the defendant table. There was no one beside me. No comforting hand on my arm. No whispered reassurance. Just the quiet scrape of the chair as I sat down. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. Laura spoke first. She talked about stability, about responsibility, about what a child needed from a father. She said my work was inconsistent. She said I worked from home and did not have a real job. She said I did not contribute enough, financially or otherwise. She said she had carried our family while I drifted from project to project. Pretending that freedom was a career, her lawyer followed. He spoke slowly, confidently, like someone explaining something obvious to a child. He said I had no fixed salary. He said I could not guarantee the same paycheck every month. He said a man who could not guarantee that had no business asking for primary custody of a child. Then Richard stood up. He did not bother with politeness. He said I had never belonged in his family. He said I lacked ambition. He said I had relied on their support for years and had nothing real to show for it. He said the word worthless like it was a fact, not an insult. Margaret wiped her eyes and talked about how hard it had been for her daughter, how disappointed she had been watching Laura struggle with a husband who refused to grow up. She spoke softly, but every word landed hard. I felt eyes on me from every direction, some curious, some sympathetic, some already bored. I said nothing. Inside, my chest was tight. My heart beat hard against my ribs, but my face stayed still. I did not look at Laura. I did not look at Richard. I looked straight ahead, at the seal behind the judge, and waited. When it was my turn, the judge leaned forward slightly and asked about my finances. His voice was neutral, but I could hear the doubt beneath it. He asked how I intended to support my daughter without a stable income. I stood up. My hands trembled, just a little. I kept them at my sides. I said I had documents I wished to submit. Nothing more. A clerk took the folder from my hands. It was thick. He raised his eyebrows slightly before handing it to the judge. The judge opened it. At first, nothing changed. He flipped a page, then another. His face stayed serious, unreadable. Laura shifted in her seat. Richard crossed his arms. The judge kept reading. He paused. He went back a page, then forward again. The room was so quiet I could hear someone breathing behind me. The judge cleared his throat. He looked up at me, then back down at the papers. He asked for a short recess. Laura turned toward me for the first time. Her face had lost its color. We all stood again. The judge left. The room buzzed with whispers. But no one spoke to me. I sat back down and folded my hands. I thought about Emily. She was 10 years old. She liked pancakes on Saturdays and hated socks with seams. She fell asleep on the couch with a book in her lap and always pretended she was not tired. She was the reason I had stayed quiet for so long. When the judge returned, he did not sit right away. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Laura, then at me. He said the court had reviewed my submitted records. He said the numbers contradicted the claims made about my financial situation. He said my assets and income showed long-term stability, $8.7 million. The words landed like a dropped plate. Sharp, loud, impossible to ignore. Laura froze. Richard leaned forward, his jaw tight. Margaret stopped breathing. The judge said the narrative presented by the plaintiff did not align with the documented facts. He said custody would be reconsidered in light of this information. I sat down. I did not smile. I did not feel relief. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion. Like a weight I had been carrying for years had shifted, but not lifted. As the session ended, Laura whispered something to her lawyer. Richard stared at the table. Margaret looked straight ahead, her lips pressed together. I walked out of the courtroom alone again. But the air felt different, lighter, somehow. Or maybe I was just standing up straighter. Outside, the winter sun reflected off the concrete steps. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold, thinking about how quickly a room can turn on you, and how quickly it can turn back. Behind me, the doors closed. I did not know what would happen next. I only knew that the story they had told about me no longer fit. And that terrified them more than anything I could have said. The first time I realized how invisible I had become was years before that courtroom ever existed. It was a fall evening in 2011, Denver already cooling down after sunset, when Laura brought me to her parents' house for dinner. I remember standing at the door with a bottle of wine in my hand, rehearsing polite answers in my head like a teenager about to meet a principal. Richard Hale opened the door and sized me up in a single glance. Not rude, not friendly, just measuring. Dinner was formal without trying to be. Heavy table, heavy chairs, quiet clink of silverware. Margaret asked me where I grew up and nodded politely at my answers. Laura smiled too much, the way people do when they want everything to go smoothly. Richard asked me what I did for a living. I told him I worked as a financial consultant, independent, mostly project-based. I explained that I helped companies restructure cash flow, plan long-term investments, clean up problems they did not even realize they had yet. I said it calmly, confidently, because at the time, I was proud of what I did. He asked how much I made. I hesitated, then answered honestly. I said my income varied. Some months were quiet. Some months were heavy. I explained that over a year it balanced out. He did not ask what that balance was. He asked how much I made per month. When I said it did not really work that way, something shifted in his face, just slightly. The rest of the night went on, but I was no longer a guest. I was a question mark. Laura defended me that night. She said I was smart, that I had potential, that independence mattered. Richard smiled and said potential was not the same as stability. I did not argue. I told myself it did not matter. After we got married, it mattered more than I expected. The house we moved into sat in a quiet suburb outside Denver. The down payment came from Laura's parents. It was framed as help. Temporary, no strings attached. I thanked them. Richard nodded like he had confirmed something he already believed. Every major decision after that seemed to happen without me. Renovations were discussed between Laura and her parents. School options were debated at family dinners where I was present but never consulted. When Emily was born, Richard talked about college savings before we even left the hospital. I paid our bills. I covered groceries. I handled insurance and utilities. I quietly invested my income. But none of that counted because it did not come with a pay stub on the first of the month. In 2018, Richard's logistics company hit a wall. A supplier collapsed. Cash flow tightened. Panic spread quietly through the management team. Laura came home tense, talking about her father's stress, about meetings that ran late into the night. One evening, she asked if I could take a look at some numbers, just to give an opinion. I did more than that. I spent a weekend reviewing projections, restructuring debt schedules, mapping out a recovery plan that would keep the company solvent without layoffs. I walked Richard through it step by step. He listened. He implemented it. The company survived. At the next family gathering, someone toasted Richard's leadership. Margaret beamed. Laura squeezed my hand under the table. Grateful. No one mentioned my name. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was doing this for my family, not recognition. That was the moment I started disappearing. Laura changed slowly. She began asking when my next project would start, then why there were gaps between them. She compared me to her friends' husbands, engineers, managers, men with business cards and offices. She repeated her parents' concerns as if they were neutral observations. Emily was the only constant. She climbed onto my lap while I worked, asked questions about numbers she did not understand, colored quietly beside me while I took calls. She did not care where the money came from. She cared that I was there. That was why I stayed quiet. By the time Laura filed for divorce, the story had already been written. I was unreliable. I was drifting. I was supported. I was, as Richard liked to say, never really a provider. Sitting on the courthouse steps after the first hearing, I understood something clearly for the first time. They had never been interested in what I actually did. They had decided who I was the moment I failed to fit their version of a man. I drove home that day through traffic that barely moved, watching people sit alone in their cars, thinking about how many quiet judgments get made without a word being spoken. I pulled into my driveway and sat there longer than I needed to. Inside, Emily was doing homework at the kitchen table. She looked up and asked if everything was okay. I told her yes. I told her it was just grown-up stuff. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at my desk and opened the files I had kept organized for years. Tax returns, statements, contracts, everything I had built quietly while trying not to rock the boat. I realized then that staying silent had protected everyone but me. The next morning, I put the folder back into my briefcase and closed it carefully. I did not feel angry. I felt resolved. Because if they were determined to judge my worth, then the truth was the only thing left that could speak for me, and I was done pretending that being invisible was the same as being harmless. I learned that silence only works until the moment someone decides to speak for you. The next hearing came faster than I expected. Early winter again. Gray sky hanging low over Denver. The kind of cold that settles into your bones. I parked 2 blocks away from the courthouse and walked the rest. My briefcase heavier than it had ever felt, even though nothing inside had changed. Inside, the same hallway smelled the same. Old paper, cheap coffee, nervous sweat. I sat on the bench and rested my hands on my knees, steadying my breathing. I was not scared of the numbers in that folder. I was scared of what would happen once they were no longer just mine. When the doors opened, I stood and walked in alone again. Laura was already seated. She glanced at me for a second this time, just long enough for uncertainty to flicker across her face before she looked away. Richard and Margaret sat beside her, stiff and confident, though Richard kept adjusting his cuff like it was suddenly too tight. The judge took his seat. The room settled. Laura's attorney picked up where he had left off days earlier. He talked about consistency, about predictability, about how children needed routine, not risk. He spoke as if my life were a spreadsheet missing crucial columns. I watched his mouth move and felt oddly detached, like I was watching someone else's trial. When it was my turn, the judge looked at me directly. He asked about my income again, but this time there was no impatience in his voice, just expectation. I stood. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but my hands stayed still. I walked to the clerk and handed over the folder I had carried for years without showing anyone. The clerk took it, surprised by the weight, and passed it to the judge. The sound of paper turning filled the room. At first, nothing changed. The judge read carefully, methodically. He flipped a page, then another. Laura leaned toward her lawyer and whispered something. Richard crossed his arms and leaned back. The picture of practiced confidence. The judge paused. He went back a page, then forward again. The room felt smaller, tighter. I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I focused on the seal behind the bench and kept my face still. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked up. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, then dropped back to the documents. He asked for a short recess. Laura turned fully toward me then. Her face had drained of color. Richard leaned forward, his jaw set, eyes sharp with irritation rather than concern. Margaret stared straight ahead, lips pressed thin. We stood. The judge left. The room erupted in low murmurs. No one spoke to me. I sat back down and folded my hands, feeling the familiar mix of tension and calm that comes right before something breaks. I thought about Emily again, about the way she counted steps on the sidewalk, about how she liked her pancakes cut into perfect squares, about how she never once asked me how much money I made. When the judge returned, the room quieted instantly. He did not sit right away. He rested his hands on the bench and looked around the room, as if making sure everyone was paying attention. He said the court had reviewed the submitted financial records. He said they painted a very different picture from the one presented earlier. Laura stiffened. Richard's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. The judge continued. He spoke about long-term contracts, consistent earnings, diversified investments. He spoke about stability measured over years, not months. Then he said the number, $8.7 million? It did not sound real even as it echoed in the room. A number too large to belong to the version of me they had been describing. Laura froze. Richard leaned forward sharply, his composure cracking. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. The judge said the court could not ignore documented facts. He said the narrative of a financially unreliable father did not align with the evidence. He said custody would be reconsidered based on this new understanding. I sat down slowly. I did not feel triumphant. I felt exposed, like something deeply personal had been dragged into fluorescent light. Laura whispered urgently to her lawyer. Richard shook his head slightly, as if the judge had made a simple mistake that would surely be corrected. Margaret stared at the papers on the bench like they might disappear if she refused to accept them. The judge called for additional review and adjourned the session. People stood. Chairs scraped. Conversations started and stopped. I gathered my briefcase and walked out without looking back. Outside, the cold air hit my face and I breathed it in deeply. My hands shook then, not from fear, but from release. Years of being reduced to assumptions had finally collided with something solid. I stood on the courthouse steps and watched people pass by, unaware that anything significant had just happened inside. Cars moved through traffic. Life went on. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not in a way I enjoyed, but in a way I could no longer avoid. I knew this was not the end. I could see it in the way Laura had looked at me, in the way Richard's confidence had fractured into something harder and sharper. But the story they had built around me was no longer airtight. Cracks had formed, and once cracks appear, the rest is only a matter of time. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. breathing slowly. The truth was out now. What came next would depend on how far they were willing to go to fight it. What came next arrived quietly, almost politely, which made it harder to recognize as a trap. The ruling did not come with drama or raised voices. It came in a written order a week later, clear and precise. I was granted primary physical custody of Emily. Laura received scheduled visitation. The court noted my financial stability and my consistent presence in my daughter's life. It was everything I had hoped for, and none of what I expected it to feel like. I remember standing in my kitchen reading the email on my phone while coffee burned on the stove. I read the words twice before they sank in. Then I turned off the burner, poured the coffee down the sink, and leaned against the counter until the shaking stopped. When I told Emily, she smiled carefully, like she was afraid the happiness might disappear if she moved too fast. She asked if that meant she would still sleep in her room and go to the same school. I told her yes. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to drawing at the table. That should have been the moment everything settled. For a few weeks, it almost did. Mornings became predictable. I made breakfast while Emily packed her backpack. We walked to the car together, talked about spelling tests and science projects. Evenings were quiet. Homework at the table, dinner on the couch sometimes, a show before bed. I adjusted my workload without thinking twice, turning down projects that would have pulled me away for weeks at a time. I told myself this was what winning looked like. The first sign that it was not came in the form of a question Emily asked one night while I tucked her in. She asked if I worked too much. Not accusing, just curious. I told her I worked when I needed to, and that I always made time for her. She nodded, but her eyes stayed thoughtful. A few days later, her teacher emailed me asking to schedule a brief meeting. Nothing urgent, she said, just routine. The meeting was polite, careful, the kind where everyone chooses their words slowly. She mentioned Emily had seemed distracted lately, that she had asked questions about whether her parents were arguing, that she had said something about feeling caught in the middle. I drove home with my jaw clenched, replaying every conversation I had had with my daughter. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing except the fact that Laura now had time alone with her. Then the comments started, subtle at first. Emily asked if I was always tired. She asked why I worked from home instead of an office like other dads. She asked if money was ever tight. Each question landed softly, but together they formed a pattern I could not ignore. I knew Laura well enough to recognize her voice in those questions. At the next scheduled exchange, Laura stood farther back than usual, arms crossed, expression calm but unreadable. She asked how things were going. I told her fine. She nodded and said she was glad Emily was adjusting. She paused before leaving and said something about how important it was for children to feel emotionally supported, not just financially secure. Her tone was neutral, almost caring. I did not respond. Within a month, I received notice that Laura had filed a request for a supplemental review, citing concerns about Emily's emotional well-being. No accusations, just concerns, the kind that sound reasonable on paper. I read the filing at my desk late one night after Emily had gone to sleep. The words were measured, carefully chosen. No lies, just implications. She questioned my availability. She questioned whether my work schedule created instability. She questioned whether my lifestyle placed too much pressure on a child. It was the same argument as before, just wearing a different suit. I called my attorney the next morning. She listened quietly and told me this was not unusual. She said winning a custody decision often made the losing side look for new angles. She said we would respond with facts. Facts did not stop the knot forming in my chest. Around that time, I started noticing small changes in my world. A neighbor who used to wave stopped making eye contact. Another asked casually if everything was okay at home. At a school event, I caught a conversation trail off when I approached. Laura's parents did not contact me directly. They did not need to. Their presence was felt in the way rumors moved through polite spaces. Never loud enough to challenge, always quiet enough to stick. One afternoon, Emily came home quieter than usual. She went to her room without asking for a snack. Later that night, as I helped her with homework, she hesitated before speaking. She said her mom thought I worked too much. She said her grandparents worried I was tired all the time. She asked if it was true that some dads choose money over family. The question hit harder than anything said in court. I closed the book and told her to look at me. I told her my work was part of how I took care of us, but that it would never come before her. I told her I chose her every day. She nodded, but I could tell the seed had already been planted. That was when I understood what was really happening. They had lost the legal fight, so they were shifting to a quieter battlefield. One where there were no judges, no transcripts, no clear rules, just perception. The next notice from the court arrived a week later, a hearing date for the supplemental review, an evaluation of Emily's environment and emotional state. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen long after the email closed. The house was silent. Emily was asleep. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady. I realized then that the earlier ruling had only changed the shape of the fight, not its existence. Winning had made me visible, and visibility, I was learning, came with its own kind of cost. I turned off my computer and walked down the hallway, checking on Emily one more time before going to bed. She slept curled on her side, one arm wrapped around a stuffed animal she had had since she was a baby. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching her breathe, reminding myself why I was doing all of this. Whatever came next, I would not let anyone rewrite the truth of who I was to her. The question was how far they were willing to push before they realized the truth would not bend quietly. I turned off the light and closed the door, already knowing that the next chapter of this was not going to be fought in silence. The pressure did not explode all at once. It settled in slowly, like weight added a pound at a time until breathing became difficult. The first call came 2 days after the notice for the supplemental review. Laura asked if we could talk privately, just the two of us. No lawyers. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, like we were discussing schedules instead of a legal battle over our child. I told her I preferred to keep communication in writing. She said she understood, then paused long enough for the silence to feel intentional. Later that evening, she sent a message saying she wanted what was best for Emily, and that drawn-out court battles were hard on children. She said sometimes compromise was the healthier path. I read it twice and put the phone down without responding. The next message came the following morning. She mentioned the cost of legal proceedings. She mentioned how exhausting it could be to keep defending the same things over and over. She suggested there were ways to make everything smoother if we were willing to be reasonable. I recognized the shift immediately. This was not about Emily. This was about leverage. At the next exchange, Laura waited until Emily was buckled into the car before speaking. She said she was worried about the stress all of this was putting on everyone. She said her parents felt the same way. She said they did not want things to get ugly. She said nothing threatening. She did not need to. That night, after Emily fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the new filing Laura had submitted. It was careful, restrained, and frustratingly vague. It raised concerns about my availability, my work hours, my emotional presence. It suggested an evaluation would be in the child's best interest. I could see Richard's fingerprints all over it. I called my attorney again. She told me this was a common tactic. Lose on one front, then apply pressure somewhere else. She said we would respond with documentation, schedules, references. She said the truth was still on my side. Truth did not stop the feeling that I was being boxed in. A week later, The social worker assigned to the case contacted me to schedule a home visit. Her tone was professional, neutral, practiced. She explained the process, the questions, the observations. I thanked her and hung up, then sat staring at the wall longer than I should have. That same afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Laura. She said she had been thinking a lot. She said she believed Emily needed stability above all else. She said maybe the court did not need to be involved if we could come to an agreement ourselves. She suggested a financial arrangement. I read the message slowly. She did not ask for child support, at least not directly. She framed it as support for transitions, for therapy, for ensuring Emily felt secure. She mentioned a number, casually, as if it were an afterthought. It was not a small number. I felt something harden in my chest. This was the line. Not the courtroom, not the whispers, not the filings. This, I replied that any financial matters should go through proper legal channels. I told her I was not interested in private deals. Her response came minutes later, shorter, cooler. She said she hoped I understood that prolonged conflict rarely ended well for anyone. The next few weeks blurred together. The home visit happened. The social worker asked questions about routines, about discipline, about communication. She watched how Emily and I interacted, noted how we spoke to each other, how we moved through the space. She was polite, observant, impossible to read. Emily did her homework at the table while we talked. She answered questions when asked, her voice small but steady. I could not tell if she was nervous or just tired. After the visit, I walked through the house noticing every detail I had never questioned before. The placement of furniture, the noise from the street, the way my work setup blended into the living space. Everything felt suddenly open to interpretation. That night, Laura sent another message. She said the evaluation process could take months. She said that uncertainty was hard on kids. She said maybe it would be kinder to settle things now. I did not respond. Then the pressure moved outward. A colleague called to ask if everything was okay. He said someone had mentioned I was dealing with a lot at home and that it might affect my availability. A client postponed a project, citing internal concerns. None of it was explicit. None of it could be traced back directly. Richard did not have to speak my name to make himself felt. One afternoon, Emily came home upset. She said a classmate had asked why her parents were still fighting. She said she did not know what to say. I held her while she cried, feeling the weight of a fight she had never asked for settling onto her shoulders. That night, I opened my laptop and looked at my calendar. Projects I had turned down, opportunities I had delayed, choices I had made to keep life calm. And still, calm had not come. The next message from Laura was different. She said she did not want to involve her parents anymore. She said she wanted to resolve this between us. She said if I was willing to help her financially in a meaningful way, she would withdraw the supplemental review and agree to the current custody arrangement without further challenge. There it was, clear enough to recognize, careful enough to deny if needed. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I thought about how money had followed me like a shadow for years. First as a reason to dismiss me, now as a tool to corner me. I thought about Emily sleeping down the hall. The next morning, I told my attorney everything. I showed her the messages. She frowned and said this was walking a dangerous line. She said we needed to be careful. She said responding emotionally would only strengthen their position. I asked her what would happen if this kept going. She said it could get messy. She said these situations often did. The court date for the supplemental review was set for the following month. Another stretch of waiting, of documentation, of scrutiny. I realized then that this chapter of the fight was not about proving anything anymore. It was about endurance, about how much pressure I could absorb before something cracked. That evening, as I helped Emily with her homework. She asked if things were going to be okay. I told her yes, because that was the only answer a parent should give. After she went to bed, I stood at the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. I felt tired in a way sleep would not fix. They thought money could make me bend. They thought pressure would make me choose the easier path. What they did not understand yet was that the moment they tried to turn my daughter into leverage, they had already crossed into territory where I would stop absorbing and start pushing back. The only question left was how much they had revealed without realizing it. They had revealed more than they realized, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I stopped thinking in terms of defense and started thinking in terms of clarity. Not revenge, not payback. Just the kind of clarity that comes from lining facts up and letting them speak. I called my attorney the next morning and told her I wanted to review everything from the beginning. Not just the filings from Laura, but the older statements, the earlier testimony, the assumptions that had been treated like truth. We met in her office downtown, a quiet space with glass walls and a view of traffic crawling below. She spread documents across the table, transcripts, affidavits, financial summaries submitted by Laura and her parents in the first hearings. We read in silence for a long time. Then she stopped and tapped a paragraph with her pen. "This does not line up," she said. She pointed out a section where Richard had claimed his family covered all major household expenses for years. Another section listed specific payments that did not match the timeline. It was subtle, buried under confident language. But it was there. I recognized the numbers immediately. Those figures came from structures I had helped design. Investment vehicles I had set up quietly years ago to manage my income and smooth cash flow. Funds that had been used to stabilize their operations during lean periods, routed carefully, legally, and documented. They had taken credit for support that had actually flowed through my work. My attorney leaned back and looked at me closely. "Did you ever correct this before?" I shook my head. I said I had never been asked. That silence mattered now. We dug deeper. The more we compared their statements to actual records, the clearer the pattern became. It was not one lie. It was a collection of assumptions repeated so often they had hardened into testimony. At the supplemental hearing, the tone was different from the start. Laura looked tired. Richard looked irritated rather than confident. Margaret avoided eye contact with anyone. The judge began by reviewing the purpose of the hearing. Emotional well-being, stability, accuracy. When it was time for questions, my attorney did not argue. She asked Richard to clarify specific claims from his earlier testimony. She asked him to confirm dates, amounts, sources. His answers were firm at first, then cautious. He hesitated once, then again. She introduced records, clean, organized, boring in the way that only truth can afford to be. The judge leaned forward. Laura shifted in her seat. Her lawyer whispered something to her, his tone urgent. Richard grew defensive. He raised his voice slightly, accused us of twisting details, of overcomplicating simple support. The judge asked him to lower his tone and answer the questions. Margaret spoke up, trying to soften the moment, talking about intentions rather than facts. The judge reminded her that intentions were not under review. I watched all of this quietly, hands folded, feeling something inside me settle. This was not about winning an argument. It was about the shape of reality finally asserting itself. Then the judge addressed Laura directly. He asked if she was aware of the discrepancies, if she stood by the statements submitted on her behalf. She hesitated. It was a small pause, less than a second. But in a courtroom, it might as well have been a confession. She said she trusted her parents. She said she believed the information was accurate when it was filed. The judge nodded, made a note, and moved on. By the end of the session, the room felt different again. Not electric like before, but heavy with consequence. The judge issued a warning regarding the importance of accuracy in sworn statements. He reminded both parties of their obligation to the court. Outside, Laura confronted me in the hallway for the first time since this began. Her voice was tight, controlled. She asked why I had not said anything earlier, why I had let things go this far. I told her quietly that no one had ever asked me to speak. She stared at me like she wanted to argue, then stopped. She turned away without another word. Over the next few weeks, the shift became visible. Richard stopped attending meetings he used to dominate. His company announced delays on projects that had once seemed guaranteed. Rumors moved through business circles quickly when confidence cracked. Laura called once more, her tone different now, not threatening, not persuasive, just uncertain. She asked if we could pause the review process and focus on moving forward. I told her that was up to the court. At home, life remained steady. Emily settled back into routines. The questions slowed. The tension eased just enough for her to breathe. I made a point of being present, not performative, just there. One evening, as we cleared dishes together, she asked if adults ever said things they wished they could take back. I told her yes. That sometimes people confuse what they want with what is true. She nodded and went to her room. Later that night, I sat at my desk and looked at the city lights through the window. I felt tired, but it was a different kind of tired. Not the exhaustion of being pushed, but the weariness that comes after standing your ground. I knew this was not over. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They ripple. They take time. But the direction had changed. They had tried to bend the story around me until it fit their needs. In doing so, they had exposed the seams. What followed would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would be inevitable. The fallout did not announce itself with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, in pieces, the way real consequences usually do. At first, it showed up in the spaces Richard used to dominate. Industry lunches he never missed suddenly went on without him. Invitations dried up. A mutual contact mentioned in passing that one of Richard's largest regional contracts had been put on hold pending internal review. No drama, no explanation, just uncertainty. In his world, uncertainty was the beginning of the end. Laura felt it too. She stopped calling. When we did communicate, it was brief and careful, stripped of the confidence she once carried so easily. The messages were no longer about leverage or compromise. They were about logistics, schedules, neutral ground. Margaret retreated entirely. The woman who once spoke so freely about disappointment and sacrifice now avoided contact altogether. When we crossed paths at a school event, she nodded politely and looked away. None of it felt like victory. It felt like gravity. Emily noticed the change before I did. She came home one afternoon lighter, talking more, laughing at things that would have passed quietly weeks earlier. She stopped asking questions that had no easy answers. The tension she had been carrying, without ever naming it, seemed to loosen its grip. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, she asked if things were calmer now. I told her yes. I told her sometimes storms pass without anyone realizing exactly when the sky cleared. She accepted that. I made changes without announcing them. I moved my work hours earlier so my afternoons were free. I shifted clients, trimmed commitments, built a rhythm that put school pickup and dinner at the center of the day, not to prove anything, but because I finally could. We moved a few months later. Not far, just far enough. A quieter neighborhood, fewer shared connections, a place where the past did not linger in the corners. Emily picked her room before I finished unloading boxes. She taped drawings to the wall and declared it hers. The new routine settled quickly. Mornings were steady. Evenings were unhurried. I stopped waiting for the next filing, the next email, the next threat dressed up as concern. Laura requested fewer visit adjustments. When issues came up, they were handled through the court-appointed channels without commentary or subtext. She sounded tired, not defeated, but worn down by a fight she no longer knew how to continue. Richard never reached out. A former client called one afternoon to check in. He asked how things were going, said he had heard bits and pieces. He mentioned that Richard's company was undergoing restructuring, that leadership confidence had taken a hit. He said it matter-of-factly, without satisfaction or pity. I thanked him and hung up that night. After Emily went to bed, I sat alone on the back steps and thought about how much energy had been spent trying to control a story that was never fully theirs to tell. How many words had been wasted trying to define me in ways that were convenient. I did not feel the need to respond. The court issued a follow-up order confirming the existing custody arrangement and formally closing the supplemental review. No reprimands, no speeches, just a final acknowledgement that the concerns raised had not been supported by evidence. When I read it, I felt something close to relief. But quieter, Laura sent a short message later that week. She said she hoped we could keep things focused on Emily going forward. I agreed. That was all. Emily and I settled into a life that did not require constant explanation. Weekends meant library visits, bike rides, slow breakfasts. I attended school events without scanning the room for tension. I spoke to teachers without worrying about subtext. One night, as I tucked her in, Emily asked if people ever learn when they are wrong. I told her sometimes they do, sometimes they do not. I told her what matters is what you do when you realize the truth is not what you wanted it to be. She thought about that, then asked if we could read another chapter before bed. Outside, the city hummed quietly. Traffic in the distance, a train horn far away, ordinary sounds that once felt unreachable. I realized then that the real shift had not happened in a courtroom or a hearing. It had happened in the slow erosion of their certainty, in the way control slipped when it could no longer be enforced by assumption. Karma did not yell. It did not need to. It worked in the background, rearranging things gently but permanently. As I turned off the light and closed Emily's door, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not triumph, peace, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to believe that peace might last long enough to matter. It took me a long time to understand that the word worthless had never been about money. In the months that followed, life did not suddenly become perfect or dramatic. It became ordinary in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Mornings started with sunlight through the kitchen window and the sound of Emily shuffling around looking for her shoes. Evenings ended with dishes drying on the rack and a quiet house settling into sleep. I stopped measuring time by court dates and filings. I started measuring it by smaller things. The way Emily laughed when she beat me at a board game. The way she leaned against me during movies without thinking about it. The way she talked about school with excitement instead of worry. That was when I realized what had actually been taken from me all those years. Not money, not status. It was the confidence to live without constantly explaining myself. Being called worthless in that courtroom had hurt in a way I was not prepared for. Not because I believed it, but because it echoed something I had been hearing quietly for years. The idea that a man is only as valuable as the version of him other people can immediately understand. I had spent too long trying to fit into a definition that was never meant for me. I thought about Richard sometimes, about how tightly he had held on to control, how quickly it slipped when facts replaced assumptions. I did not feel anger toward him anymore. I felt distance, the kind that makes reflection possible without reopening wounds. Laura remained part of Emily's life, as she should. Our conversation stayed brief and focused. There was no warmth, But there was no hostility either. Just an understanding that some stories end without reconciliation and still turn out okay. One afternoon, Emily asked me why people say things they do not mean when they are scared. We were sitting on the porch, watching clouds move slowly across the sky. I told her that fear makes people grab onto whatever gives them a sense of power, even if it hurts someone else. She nodded like she understood more than her years suggested. I never told her everything that happened. I did not need to. She did not need to carry that weight. She only needed to know that she was safe and loved, and that nothing about her life depended on anyone else's approval. Looking back, I see how close I came to believing the wrong lesson. For a while, I thought the point of all this was proving them wrong, showing numbers, winning rulings, watching confidence crumble. That was never the real ending. The real ending was the night I realized I no longer cared how they saw me, when the echo of their judgment finally faded enough for me to hear my own thoughts again. Worth is not loud. It does not demand attention. It shows up every day and does the work quietly. It stays when things get uncomfortable. It protects what matters without asking for applause. If there is one thing I would tell the man I was walking into that courthouse, it would be this: silence is only weakness when it is chosen out of fear. When it is chosen out of patience, it becomes strength. I did not win because I had money. I won because I stopped letting other people define my value. And if you are listening to this and recognize something of yourself in it, maybe you have been told in subtle ways that you are not enough. Maybe you have been dismissed because your life does not fit someone else's mold. If so, I hope this story reminds you that the truth has a way of standing up when you finally let it. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to share what part hit closest to home. Stories like this matter because they remind us we are not alone in these moments. And if you want to hear more real stories about quiet strength, hard lessons, and what it means to stand your ground without losing yourself, stay here. There is more to come.